Barbarians, Chapters 7, 8, and 9, Forged in Ice and Fire. We come from the land of the ice and snow, from the midnight sun where the hot springs blow. The hammer of the gods will drive our ships to new lands, to fight the horde, singing and crying, Valhalla, I am coming. Led Zeppelin, Immigrant Song. The suite of rooms that had become the de facto military headquarters still had something of an unfinished look. For convenience, they'd located HQ in the Ministry Center, though even that simple decision had been hotly debated. There were some who worried about the optics, that to outside observers it might appear as if Earth had staged a coup d'etat during the triumvirates, or tetrarchy. The subject had been moved to the back burner for the duration, hour of need. So far, none of the races had raised that point, but Minister Singh and some of the more canny human observers assumed it was only a matter of time. There was a small but vocal minority that had suggested doing just that. After all, how would the triumvirate stop them? The malcontents had been quickly squelched, but Leandra couldn't help but worry the idea might start gaining traction, especially if things went badly on the war front. She'd made it a habit to sit in on the planning meetings, mostly to stay abreast of developments and offer a political viewpoint when needed. Other than that, she did her level best to stay out of the way of the professionals and let them handle the business of running the war. "Where are we at with the freighter conversions?" Marshal Antuma asked his Navy commander. Admiral Fujimoto grimaced. "Nowhere near what I'd like," she admitted. "We have 27 fully converted, with another 30 or so in various stages of being upgraded. On the plus side, the space docks are beginning to hit their stride, so those numbers should climbing rapidly in the next few weeks." "And the minus side of the equation?" Antuma asked quietly. "Weapons production," Fujimoto sighed. "Most of the fabricators simply aren't capable of meeting our needs. They were designed for purely domestic consumption, and retooling them for our purposes would be a gigantic time sink. The fabricators we can use are running 3 shifts non-stop, but we're still falling rapidly behind on our quotas." The Marshal nodded, taking that in. "Is there anything we can do to increase production?" Helene shook her head. "I've crunched the numbers until I'm blue in the face, and I keep getting the same answers. Any personnel and resources I pull off fabrication and shift over to constructing new fabricators will give us increased output, enough to meet our quota in 8 to 10 months. "By which time the war is likely to be over," Antuma said sourly, "one way or another." "Exactly," Fujimoto agreed. "If you order me to, I can rob Peter to pay Paul, but I'd strongly advise against it. If it was just weapons for the freighters we were talking about, I might be willing to risk it, but we still have to build the comets, and what we have planned for the Ronin, of course." Marshal Antuma leaned back in his chair, folding his arms behind his head and gazing up at the ceiling. Helene had dubbed it his thinking pose, and she settled into her own as he worked through whatever problem his mind was currently tangling with. "Amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics," he murmured, drawing a chuckle from his counterpart. "Even with fabricators and FTL drive, that hasn't changed," she agreed. The smile quickly left her face as she leaned forward. "I still don't like the stratagem we've come up with for the freighters," she said grimly. "Assuming everything goes according to plan, we stand a decent chance of blunting their advance. But how often does that happen?" "Never," Antuma said quietly. Admiral Fujimoto nodded. "I've reached deep into my personal bag of tricks and pulled out every last scheme and ruse to pull this off, but it's a crapshoot at best." She eyed him levelly across the table. "No matter what happens, most of those crews won't be coming back." "I know," he said tiredly, "but what choice do we have? If we don't slow their advance, we'll have nothing left to defend." Helene silently digested that for several moments, though it was nothing she hadn't already known. "We need more intel," she said at last. "I've been poring over the imagery we got from Wayfarer, but it doesn't tell us much. Their ships didn't face any resistance, so we know nothing about how well they'd stand up against someone who's willing to fight. But their formations are sound, with decent coverage between ships. That tells me they know what they're doing." Kwasi simply shrugged. "Until your freighters meet them in battle, we won't know what we're up against, not until they have someone to fight." He sighed. "But you're right, we do need more information." He took a deep breath. "We need someone on the ground." The Admiral gave a low whistle. Gonna be damn difficult inserting a team under their noses. It'll have to be pure human, you realize. The trainees from the other races are nowhere near ready for an op like that. Believe me, I'm all too aware of that, the marshal said unhappily. But could you do it? Get a squad onto one of the occupied worlds without being detected? Her eyes lost focus as she considered the problem. I can get them in, she said at last. But getting them back out? Helene shrugged helplessly. They'll have to find a way past the ships in orbit, and at the moment I'm not sure if that's even possible. Plus, it'll mean pulling resources from our other commitments. Can't be helped, he said firmly. We're shooting blind here, and that will hurt us even more badly than a little slippage in our refit schedule. It's likely to be a lot of slippage, but I take your meaning. She cocked her head, regarding him. Have someone in mind? A few, he admitted. I've been considering it for a while now, and I've been looking at who we have with the right kind of skills. I'll find the bodies, he assured her. Make sure you tell them it's likely to be a rough ride, she warned him. I just wish we had more of a pattern to work with. I'd prefer to send them in before an assault than after. With only 2 worlds attacked thus far, it's more than a little challenging trying to guess where they'll hit next. The marshal started to reply, but as he began to speak he was interrupted by an Ophipteran aide, who silently slid a tablet onto the table before withdrawing. Antima picked up the pad and started to read, only to close his eyes in pain as he set it back down. Make that 3, he said softly. Dayaksh Giaj Guyaz stepped off the assault craft and onto the surface of the Horde's latest conquest. This planet belonged to the machine race, making its architecture and infrastructure mostly unsuitable for the needs of the Konim. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, they burned. The first 2 worlds had fallen like overripe fruit, and Giaj had no doubt this planet would be no different. The sagas of their forebears had spoken of terrible battles, but whatever their enemy might have been long ago, they were now mere shadows of their former selves. They had followed the path of peace for so long they had forgotten their past, forgotten them, and had become little more than mindless prey animals. There was a part of him that deeply regretted that. For what challenge was there for a warrior against an enemy that could not, fight? Against any other species he would have shown mercy, taken their surrender as a matter of course, and treated them with the respect due a fallen adversary. But his forebears demanded otherwise, their spirits crying out for vengeance, and until all the enemy's worlds lie broken and ravaged at his feet, they would not slumber. They had waited many long years for this day, and he would not deny them their revenge. The riven and shattered housings of the machine mines lay scattered everywhere as he walked alone through the strange, alien city. Like their soft, fleshy allies, the machines had tried to run, tried to hide, but there was nowhere they could go that the Konim would not discover, sooner or later. It did not make up for the lack of struggle, but it would entertain the Horde for a time, as they tracked them to their warrens and dug them out of their holes. They would find uses for the ones they allowed to live, if one could call a machine alive. They had taken slaves from the other 2 worlds, and if those pathetic creatures were unable to fight, they could still serve the Konhim in other ways. They would man their factories till their farms serve in their homes. Even the poorest of the Horde would have their share of prisoners to choose from, though that concerned him as well. What would happen to the people then? The flaming star had shown them the error of their ways once before, bringing them back to the path of war so long ago. It now formed the centerpiece of the Horde's banner. But once they had slaked their thirst for vengeance, would they still remember the lesson it had taught them? He had searched long and hard for the answer to that question, but their forebears were strangely silent on that subject. If in the fullness of time they decided to send yet another rock from the heavens to show them their error, then so be it. He would accept their judgment, for he had already given them what they had desired for so very long. The flames burned steadily higher in the shattered community, the smoke filling his nostrils even as he spied one of the machines attempting to flee. Its mind was housed in some sort of wheeled contraption, a delivery vehicle of some sort, and even before he was able to make a conscious thought, his weapon was in his hands, barking loudly. The first shot appeared to have done no damage, but the second and third rounds most certainly did. A screeching cry erupted from the machine creature, the sound of metal being torn apart by a saw blade as it slowly ground to a halt, its lights dimming before going dark for good. "Diaksh!" he heard one of his officers cry, "We have found something!" Giage holstered his weapon and turned towards the sound, spotting a squad moving towards him, bearing something on a litter. As they drew nearer, he recognized the polished metal sphere they carried, the brain of one of the machine folk. The squad came to a halt before him, as the officer pounded his clenched fists to his chest in salute. "Speak!" he commanded as the officer bowed his head. "During the sack, I discovered this creature," he answered, pointing to the sphere. "It wore the body of a four-legged walker, and I thought to have some fun with the beast. I tore away its limbs, leaving only stumps, and we laughed as it still tried to escape." A sneer appeared on his face as he looked with contempt at the machine. "And this interests me how?" Giage asked. "We soon grew bored of the game," the officer said quickly. "I was preparing to dispatch it when it begged for its life." Giage's features darkened. "As do they all," he growled. "If there is a point to be made here, I suggest you find it rapidly." He was swiftly losing his patience with this warrior. "Forgive me, Deaksh," he answered. "I will speak plainly. As it pleaded to me, it claimed it had information of great interest to us. At first, I assumed it to merely be a ruse, a desperate attempt to survive, but then it spoke of something that stayed my hand." "Indeed?" Perhaps there was something to be learned here after all. He turned towards the sphere. "Speak, machine." A small tinny voice came from the orb. "If I tell you, you will allow me to continue my existence," it whispered. "I can show you what will happen if you do not tell me," Giage snarled. He withdrew his weapon once more and pressed it against the shiny metal. "Choose, machine." "You are in danger!" the machine howled, desperately trying to stave off its impending doom. "Even now, forces are being gathered to fight you." Giage threw back his head and laughed. "Let them come! They will pose as little threat as you have." "You do not understand," the machine whimpered. "The ones coming for you, they are not of the triumvirate. The humans are a primitive species, but they are warlike and dangerous." The Deaksh froze, staring at the sphere. Slowly, he returned his weapon to its holster. "Tell me more of these humans," Giage commanded. "Gravity keeps my head down. Or is it maybe shame at being so young and being so vain? Holes in your head today, but I'm a pacifist. I've walked La Rambla, but not with real intent. Manic Street preachers, if you tolerate this, your children will be next." Formerly acolyte, now recruit Nassat, struggled to keep his weapon on the target, the way Drill Sergeant Lin had shown them. It wasn't the fault of the weapon, sadly, no matter how much he would have liked to blame the evil thing cradled in his arms. The Mark 1B, the Mark IA being the human variant, unsurprisingly enough, was a straightforward piece of technology, simple enough to operate, even if he could barely bring himself to look at it. No matter how hard he tried to keep the weapon steady on the target, the barrel would inevitably slide away, or his hands would begin to shake so badly aiming was just flat out impossible. He was a disaster as a soldier, and he knew it. Though compared to the other recruits in Bravo Company, he probably scored somewhere in the upper third. It was just that training to fight, to kill, was so foreign, so alien to his nature that every fiber of his being rebelled against it, no matter how hard he tried. The same was true for all the others as well, though there were a few things here and there he and his fellow Sortors seemed to do reasonably well. Marching, for one, though being a herd species probably had something to do with that. When the situation called for large groups to do the same thing in unison, racial memory seemed to kick in automatically. Individual tasks like weapons training, on the other hand, were proving far more difficult. "It's just a target, people!" Sergeant Lin shouted. "You can't hurt it!" He marched up and down the firing line, checking to see if they were set. "Left side is ready. Right side is ready, shooters. Commence firing," he ordered, as a ragged volley of coughs rippled up and down the line. Nassat forced himself to concentrate on what they'd learned during marksmanship training, as he began to squeeze the trigger. The bull's eye was clearly visible in his helmet's targeting system, which was tied into the weapon, and once he had it locked in, the ammunition would do the rest. And yet, despite all the built-in advantages to the weapon, he, using it with any degree of proficiency, seemed to be forever beyond him. The target seemed to swim before his eyes as the shakes started up almost immediately, and in his hurry to simply be done with it, he jerked the trigger in rapid succession, emptying his magazine well before Sergeant Lin shouted, "Cease fire!" He cleared the weapon as he'd been shown, standing by as their drill sergeant checked their scores, before shaking his head in disgust. "Unfucking believable," he snarled. "If that had been a real enemy out there, you'd all be dead." The human glared at them all in turn, before turning his attention directly towards him. "Nasat! Front and center!" he shouted, as he winced in anticipation for what was to come. They'd all quickly learned that being singled out for anything was never good, but he carried his weapon at port arms as he trotted up to face the sergeant. "Recruit Nasat reporting as ordered, drill sergeant!" he shouted at the top of his lungs, as Lin glowered at the rest of the company. "I think it's time we had a real demonstration," he said darkly, as he reached into his pack and retrieved another magazine, handing it over to Nasat. "Lock and load, recruit," he ordered as Nasat hastened to do as he'd commanded. That much at least he could do correctly. They'd drilled over the simple procedure so many times he could perform it in his sleep. As he readied his weapon, Sergeant Lin removed his sidearm and swapped out magazines as well, as that evil smile appeared on his face once more. "Combat is simple, boys and girls," Lin told them. "If you don't kill your enemy, he will kill you." He turned and walked away from Nasat until they stood about 30 meters apart, before facing him once more. "The ammo you have loaded is a training round," the drill sergeant explained, "just like what I have in my weapon. It won't kill you or cause any real damage, but it will cause excruciating pain if it hits you." Nasat shuddered in sheer terror as he stared at the predator facing him, non-lethal weapon or no. Lin holstered his sidearm as the grin on his face grew wider. "Allow me to introduce you to an old human tradition known as the gunfight, Nasat. On the count of 3, I will draw my weapon and fire. If you haven't shot me by time I do, well..." He cackled with glee at the prospect of causing him pain, as Nasat's eyes darted about looking for escape. There was none to be found, of course, and even as he did, the rest of the company sidled away, giving him a very wide berth. "Are you ready, recruit?" Lin asked, and what he wanted to say, "Dear Creator, no," but they'd all learned by now there was only one acceptable answer to the question. "Yes, drill sergeant," he replied, even as he began to tremble in fear once more. "Good," Lin replied, licking his lips in anticipation. "One!" he shouted. Nasat struggled to bring the weapon up, but it seemed so heavy in his arms, as if it were suddenly made of lead. "2!" Lin counted off, and time itself seemed to slow down to a crawl as he fought to point the weapon at the human target. "Please, Creator, I don't want to do this!" His mind howled even as he felt his finger begin to tighten on the trigger. 3! The human's hand darted down to his holster, and it seemed impossible that any living being could move so fast as the weapon was pulled free, whipping up to point directly at him, when Sergeant Lin suddenly disappeared. Nasat stared in shock. What had just happened? His eyes whipped around in panic, only to spot the drill sergeant seated on the ground, drawing deep breaths as he grimaced in pain. He looked down at his weapon in horror, before returning his gaze to the human, who, despite the pain he must be feeling, was now grinning madly at him. "Good job, Nasat," he managed to get out. "You did it." He pointed to a red mark on the center of his chest. "Good aim, too," he chuckled as he slowly rose to his feet. The young recruit could only stare at him in dismay. "I'm sorry, drill sergeant," he managed to get out, only to have Sergeant Lin snarl at him once more. "Sorry?" he shouted. "God damn it, when are you people going to fucking learn?" The rest of the company shrank back from him once more as he advanced on Nasat. "This entire company will be going into combat. People die in combat, and the only thing that will keep you alive is what you learn here." He stopped a mere handbreadth away and poked him in the chest. "We will perform this drill every day, all of you, until it becomes second nature, and anyone I catch stalling or missing intentionally, I will shoot myself. Do you understand?" "Yes, drill sergeant!" the company shrieked back at him. Lin spent a few more moments glowering at them before returning his attention to Nasat. "Next time, don't wait so long to fire," he told him. "The enemy won't give you 3 seconds. He won't even give you one. If you don't kill him, he will absolutely kill you." The human paused, as his voice dropped down to an almost conversational tone. "If you learn anything from me, learn that," he said quietly, before waving Nasat back to the others. All right, you useless bastards. Draw training ammo and pair up. Time to see who wants to stay alive, he growled, as Nasat struggled to make sense of what he'd just learned. Hell no, we won't go! Hell no, we won't go! Hell no, we won't go! Governor General Granville stared out the window at the chanting crowd and sighed. They were peaceful thus far, and from what he'd seen would probably remain so. He'd read about this kind of thing in the history books, but he'd never imagined he'd actually see an anti-war protest in his lifetime. Thankfully, they were a rather small, if somewhat vocal minority, but he was beginning to grow concerned that the sentiment would start to spread. He really should have seen this coming, Granville realized sadly, and the irony of the situation bordered on the ludicrous. Humans were such a contrary and cantankerous bunch. Tell them that the sky was blue and half of them would argue it was actually green out of sheer cussedness, while the more pedantic types would insist on pointing out it really varied from black to red to yellow, before ever turning blue. A sizable bunch would contend it was all some sort of conspiracy, while the rest would simply shrug their shoulders in contemptuous apathy. There were times when he didn't blame the triumvirate one bit for keeping them at arm's length. For 90 years, humanity had chafed on the restrictions imposed on it, as they'd struggled to find ways to channel man's aggressions. There had been plenty over the years that had demanded war, and now that they had one, they were demanding peace. Granville sincerely hoped it wasn't the same group in both cases, but you never knew. He sighed yet again as the crowd took up a new chant. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't need your Xeno war! There probably wasn't anyone in that crowd who was in actual danger of being drafted. The psychological screenings had been fairly thorough, and any of the wannabes that only played at war were utterly and completely unsuitable for the task at hand. Of course, there was no telling them that. The training camps that had sprung up around the globe were churning out recruits as fast as they could cycle them through, but by any realistic standard, they were woefully unprepared. Granville dreaded the casualty reports he knew would soon be crossing his desk. But unless they sent somebody out to fight, and quickly, the triumvirate would fall. And then what would happen to Earth? Granville didn't know, but the possibilities flat out terrified him. In the wake of the latest attack, an emergency meeting had been called, as the ministers demanded actually most of them, that the newly formed units go out and do something. They were trying to do just that, but these sorts things took time, and it seemed no one was willing wait. Ministers included. You must attack, Lassorth wailed, before any of our other worlds fall to the invaders. Marshal Antuma did his best to maintain an outward appearance of calm. Minister, we're simply not ready, he informed her. We need more time to build up our forces. How much more time will you require, given that every day we delay means more casualties? Komzoicha demanded. Our current projections suggest at least another month, Admiral Fujimoto replied. Any less, and we risk not only losing the forces we send against them, but also tipping our hand. If we give the enemy an idea of our capabilities before we've built up a sizable enough navy, we give them a chance to find ways to counter our strategies. And have you calculated how many worlds will fall in that time? Sigma 121 Sub-Delta countered. How many of our citizens will be lost? The two humans suddenly looked uncomfortable, and Leandra inwardly grimaced. She was no more sanguine to their losses than they were, but she at least had the advantage of knowing Earth's bloody history. It's difficult to say for certain, Antuma said at last. At least 1 or 2 more planets will likely fall before we're ready to take the fight to them. I'm sorry, ministers, but there's simply no way around that. We must be patient, Leandra counseled. I know it's difficult, seeing the images from those worlds, but if we attack before we're ready, we risk losing everything. Unacceptable, Lassorth howled. Too many have already died. You asked us to help you, Helene told them, since we have more experience in these matters, and that's exactly what we're trying to do. So please, I urge you, listen to those who have studied tactics and strategy their entire lives. Give us the time we need, she pleaded with them. Our citizens grow more terrified with every passing day, Sigma 121 Sub-Delta said firmly. In a month's time, there may be nothing left for you to defend. All right, Marshal Antuma said quietly, drawing a surprised look from his counterpart. We'll try. But she began to say before he interrupted. If we ignore the morale of the citizenry, we do so at our peril. What may end up being a tactical defeat could also become a strategic victory, he told her, before she reluctantly nodded in agreement. God help us all, Leandra whispered. Follow orders as you're told. Make their yellow blood run cold. Fight until you die or drop. A force like ours is hard to stop. Close your mind to stress and pain. Fight till you're no longer sane. Let not one damn cur pass by. How many of them can we make die? Heather Alexander, March of Cambreth. Commodore Karime Fuentes struggled unsuccessfully to avoid checking the chronometer for the umpteenth time since they'd arrived on station. The 42 ships of Task Force Odysseus had waited silently for almost a week now, hidden away in the depths of the Uzonks system, and she was beginning to wonder if perhaps Antuma and Fujimoto hadn't guessed wrong after all. Humanity's practical experience in space combat was rather limited, and a century out of date. There'd been a series of skirmishes over Titan, and a rather brutal slugging match in Mars orbit over 150 years ago, but neither of those had been naval battles in the true sense of the word. No capital ships, no carefully planned tactics or strategies, just two small forces throwing what weapons they had at each other and hoping for the best. No matter what happened, this one would be one for the books, assuming it happened at all. At the moment, all the triumvirate Navy had for ships were converted freighters. They had no internal weapons, no armor, no shields of any sort, and it wouldn't take much to pound them into scrap. There was no way they could sneak in close enough to the enemy vessels to strike a serious blow, which meant the enemy would have to come to them. If the freighters could stay powered down long enough for the enemy's stumble over them, they stood a decent chance of doing some serious damage. The Joker in the deck was trying to predict where the enemy would strike next and setting up their ambush before they arrived. The enemy had moved in a fairly straight line since the first attack, but there were 3 different worlds that fell on that axis, any of which could be the next target. They'd run the variables through the computers a dozen times, trying to narrow it down, but in the end they'd been forced to go with their gut. If they'd guessed wrong and Uzonks wasn't the target, they'd be forced to withdraw and try again. Helene Fujimoto had really outdone herself planning this, Karime had to admit. She'd gone up against her more than once in the guild, only to get schooled each and every time. It was a gigantic throw of the dice, but if things broke their way, they might just have a shot. Who knows, they might even survive. The trick lay in hiding the ships until they could launch their attack, and Admiral Fujimoto had come up with a doozy. Once they'd found a nice asteroid field to hide in, they'd emptied their water tanks, coating each freighter with a thick layer of ice. It wouldn't fool an active scan pointed in their direction for very long, but on passive scans they should look like a scattering of rocky snowballs. In theory, at least. Helene always was a sneaky bitch, Commodore Fuentes thought to herself in grudging admiration. In fact, "Contact!" her helmsman shouted suddenly, pulling her out of her reveries. "Reading multiple ships, bearing 187 by 013 degrees. Karime pulled up her own display and muffled a silent curse. They were coming in close to the bearing they'd predicted, but there were over 100-point targets out there, all on a least time course for Uzonks. Those were some long damn odds, but then she'd always known they'd be outnumbered. "Alert the other ships by comm laser and tell them to stand by," she ordered. The timing for this operation had to be perfect if they were going to have a prayer of pulling it off. Her task force of converted freighters were laughably outgunned by the enemy ships, but there was one factor they had in their favor. They had lots of cargo room. "Tell the loadmasters to get ready," she told her crew as orders were passed by intercom as the ships came closer. "We'll open the cargo doors in 3 minutes from my mark." After they'd turned their ships into icebergs, her crew had gone EVA with cutting torches to ensure the doors would open, but there was always the chance that the ice had reformed. They could blow the doors if they had to, but that would just send the enemy a signal they couldn't possibly miss. "Cargo bay doors opening," the crew informed her minutes later. "Payload is being deployed." "Inform the engine room I want those reactors hot the instant we fire," she told them, never taking her eyes off the screen. The engines were currently powered down to avoid detection, but once they fired, the enemy would know they were there. They'd need those reactors powered up and ready to make their escape. She watched for any sign their efforts had been noticed, but so far the enemy was still boring in, fat, dumb, and happy. Her eyes narrowed as she took a closer look at the enemy's formation and tugged her ear thoughtfully. Their pattern was odd, almost as if they were each maneuvering separately. Was it possible they'd never drilled in fleet tactics? If they hadn't faced another enemy in space, that would make sense, but the very fact their ships were armed seemed to belie that. She filed that fact away, secure in the knowledge that everything they observed was being recorded for the drones. If the worst happened, hopefully at least some record of their battle would survive. Her comm officer touched his ear and looked over at her. "All ships report deployment complete, Commodore," he said quietly as she nodded in reply. She was operating on pure instinct now, gauging the perfect moment by eye and experience alone. "Come on, just a little closer," her mind whispered as the final piece fell into place. "Fire!" she commanded, as the missiles they'd been quietly dumping into space suddenly went active, their homing radars searching for targets as they roared away from the task force. "Missiles inbound!" the tactical officer said in shock, as alarms began to blare. "We're reading 20,000 incoming projectiles, estimated time of impact, 0.30 seconds. Diakshjiaj Guyaz's head snapped around as defensive systems came online. "Evasive maneuvers!" he shouted, as the fleet began to scatter. "Target the missiles and find me those ships." "Reactors hot, engines to full!" Fuentes bellowed, as the task force began pulling away from the enemy fleet. They'd shot their bolt, and now it was time to make their escape. The lumbering freighters were slow to respond, but for the moment at least the enemy was otherwise engaged. With any luck, that would buy them enough time to get underway, but in the interim, she still had a few cards left to play. "Dump the chaff!" she shouted as pallets of metal shards were kicked out the open cargo doors, a small explosive charge scattering the debris once the ships were clear. As long as the clouds of chaff were between them and the enemy, any attempt to target the freighters would be hopelessly degraded. Oathkeeper's tactical officer howled in frustration as his displays suddenly turned into blooms of static hash. "They're interfering with my scans!" he cried out, even as the fleet began firing on the missiles. Counter-missiles and automatic rapid-fire cannon blazed away at the incoming warheads, and they started being knocked out of the sky by the hundreds. But thousands of their brethren threaded their way through the defensive fire, their homing radar pinging madly as they went screaming in for the kill. So far, everything was going exactly to plan, which only made Commodore Fuentes even more nervous. The Demon Murphy had yet to put in an appearance, which could only mean when he did show up, it would be spectacular, and not in a good way. The freighters were slowly but steadily picking up speed, and as of yet, none of the enemy was in pursuit. Just in case they were coming, however. "Release the mines!" she ordered, as even more pallets were ejected from the cavernous cargo holds, scattering thousands of explosive mines in their wake. With any luck, the enemy would come blundering through the chaff cloud, only to slam into minefield now behind them. If that happened, kaboom! The incoming missiles were in their final boost phase now, and while the defensive fire was winnowing them down, there were still thousands left. Oathkeeper's bridge crew collectively held its breath as they waited until the last possible second. And then... "Fire capacitors!" Giage snarled as the fleet suddenly exploded with a massive burst of electromagnetic energy. The pulse wave radiated outward, crashing into the incoming missiles, and turning the overwhelming majority of them into harmless hunks of metal easily shrugged off. Some of the missiles managed to survive the blast and detonated against the Konim ships, suddenly belching air and plasma. A handful of ships were badly damaged, and Vengeance and Reprisal exploded in balls of fire, but the rest of the fleet was still very much in the fight. "EMP!" the helmsman howled as Karimi's eyes widened in horror. That blast of energy had destroyed almost all of the missiles, and her heart sank as she realized that Murphy had shown up after all. "Missiles had minimal effect," her XO said quietly for the record, as she realized just how bad things were about to get. "Ready the Hail Mary," she ordered. "After them!" Giage ordered as the fleet changed course, following the fleeing ships. All they had was the general direction, as the clouds of chaff still interfered with their sensors. He leaned forward, peering closely at the display, as sudden suspicion gnawed at him. "Alter course," her ordered the helmsman. They have disrupted our sensors for a reason, and I suspect whatever awaits us on the other side, we will not find to our liking. Avoid the jamming field and converge on the other side. At once, Diaksh, his helmsman responded as he steered Oathkeeper around the chaff cloud. Commodore Fuentes clenched her jaw as the enemy ships began altering course. They didn't buy it, she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. She had exactly one trick left in her bag, and if that didn't work, they were doomed. Giage's eyes glittered with recognition as Oathkeeper cleared the chaff cloud. Clever, but not clever enough, he smirked as the waiting minefield suddenly appeared on their screens, along with the escaping freighters. Target those ships and fire! Now it was the enemy's turn, and Fuentes winced as her task force was ripped apart. Fire the Hail Mary! She howled, as the remaining freighters spat out dozens of missiles into the face of the pursuing fleet. The flight time was mere seconds as the enemy closed the gap, as a string of fusion bombs detonated right in their lap. Radiation alarms wailed as their screens blanked automatically. There was no time to evade, so the Konim ships simply charged through the blasts, their hulls taking the brunt of the deadly fire, and kept on coming. Karime had only a few seconds to realize just how badly they'd underestimated the enemy, slapping a red button on her console to send the message drones away from her ship, mere moments before it disappeared in a ball of fire. So much for these humans, Giage smiled in triumph as the last ships died.